$11,000. That's what 180 acres in Eastfield County sold for at a county estate auction in the spring of 1990. Cheap enough that the auctioneer made a joke about it before the gavel even came down. Cheap enough that most of the regular bidders in the room didn't bother raising a paddle at all. 3 years later, the same people who couldn't be bothered to bid on Brier Hollow Farm were calling the county land trust office to ask, carefully and a little sheepishly, whether any part of it might still be available to buy. Brier Hollow had a reputation in Eastfield County long before Owen Sharp ever set foot on it. The kind of reputation that gets handed down less as fact than as folklore, repeated at the feed store and the diner counter until nobody quite remembered which parts were true. 3 owners in 11 years had tried to farm that low-bottom land and failed, every one of them losing their corn or soybeans to a spring flood that seemed to know exactly which acres to ruin, until the last family, the Tullis, walked away from it entirely rather than fight the ground a 4th season running. People in the county had stopped calling it bad luck by then and started calling it cursed, the kind of word that gets said half joking and half serious in a place where everyone still remembers their grandfather's stories. Owen Sharp had worked other men's land for 11 years by the time that auction came around, never once owning so much as an acre himself. And when he raised his hand for Brier Hollow that spring morning, the room went quiet in a way that had less to do with respect than with the particular silence of people watching someone make what they were certain was a mistake. 3 years after that auction, in the late summer of 1993, the man who had personally handled the Tully foreclosure and signed off on the sale that put Brier Hollow in Owen Sharp's hands was sitting at a special county hearing watching a hearing officer read his own 20-year-old drainage easement back to him as the reason his case against Owen didn't have a leg to stand on. Garrison Lock had run the largest farming operation in Eastfield County for the better part of 2 decades, chaired the county agricultural land trust that handled estate and foreclosure sales like the Tullis, and sat on the Millbrook Valley Irrigation and Drainage Board that decided, more or less unilaterally, who got water and who didn't across the entire valley. The hearing room that August afternoon was packed past its usual capacity, county residents standing along the back wall in a building that normally drew a handful of board attendees to routine drainage business, drawn instead by the particular promise of watching a man who had spent 2 decades being right about everything finally have to explain himself in front of people who had once laughed along with him at Owen Sharp's expense. Nobody in that room, including most of the people who had once joked about cursed dirt at the feed store, could have told you with any confidence what an easement filed 20 years earlier actually had to do with a man's cranberry beds, or why the very water everyone in the county had spent a decade calling a curse was about to be read aloud, as the reason an entire hearing went exactly the opposite direction Garrison Lock had walked in expecting. They would learn all of it before the gavel came down. None of that had happened yet on the cold spring morning in 1990 when Owen Sharp walked the flooded, half-frozen bottomland of Brier Hollow Farm for the first time as its owner, looking at exactly the same ruined ground 3 other families had already given up on, and saw, for reasons nobody else in the county had ever bothered to consider, something other than a curse. To understand how 180 acres nobody wanted became the piece of ground half the county wished they'd bought instead, you have to start with the man who controlled almost everything else worth owning in Eastfield County, and the land he was certain would finally prove him right about the one man who'd ever quietly defied him. Eastfield County had never been a place that rewarded a hired hand for thinking he knew better than the man who ran the largest operation in the valley, and the story of Brier Hollow, more than anything else that happened in those 3 years, became the kind of thing people still brought up at the feed store counter long after most of the finer details had blurred into something closer to legend. Some remembered it as a story about cranberries. Others remembered it as a story about a man who had spent 20 years so certain of his own judgment that he forgot the exact wording of the one document that would eventually prove him wrong. Millbrook Valley ran low and flat through the center of Eastfield County, good corn and soybean ground on either side of a slow river that had supported row crop farming for most of a century, and Garrison Lock's family had been working the best of that ground since his grandfather first cleared it in the 1920s. By the time Garrison took the operation over from his father in the early 1970s, Lock Farms had grown to roughly 1,200 acres, the largest single operation in the county by a wide margin, and Garrison did not stop there. He chaired the Eastfield County Agricultural Land Trust, the body that handled the sale of foreclosed and estate properties across the county, which meant that almost any farm that came up for sale under difficult circumstances passed through his hands at some point before it passed to a new owner. He also sat on the Millbrook Valley Irrigation and Drainage Board, the body that allocated water rights and approved drainage modifications for every property along the valley floor, a position that gave him considerably more influence over his neighbors' farming decisions than most of them fully appreciated. People in Eastfield County had a way of talking about Garrison Lock that sounded almost like deference until you sat with it a moment. Nothing got bought, sold, drained, or irrigated in that valley without Garrison having some hand in it first. Farmers who crossed him on a water allocation or a drainage permit tended to find their requests scheduled a little slower the following season, never quite enough to point to directly as retaliation, just enough that most landowners in the valley had learned, over the years, that staying on Garrison's good side was simply easier than testing how far his patience actually extended. Owen Sharp had grown up 2 counties over, the son of a tenant farmer who'd never owned land of his own in his life, and Owen had spent 11 years after high school working other men's operations across 3 counties, learning everything about soil, drainage, and crop management that a man could learn without ever once having a deed of his own to apply it to. He'd moved between operations more than once over those years, chasing steadier work or slightly better pay, and along the way had picked up the kind of broad, varied experience that came from never staying in one place long enough to specialize narrowly in a single crop the way most lifelong farmers in Eastfield County had. He had saved carefully through those 11 years, a few $1,000s at a time, skipping most of what other men his age spent freely on, until he had something close to $12,000 set aside and started, quietly, looking for ground he could finally call his own. What Owen found, every time he asked around about anything decent coming up for sale, was the same polite version of the same answer almost everyone in his position eventually heard in Eastfield County. Nothing good was on the market, or what little was available had already been promised to a family with 3 generations of history in the valley, or the price climbed the moment word got out that a hired hand with modest savings was asking about it. Owen understood, after enough of these conversations, that the good ground in Eastfield County moved through channels that had very little to do with open listings and a great deal to do with who you already knew. Channels he had no family history to plug into no matter how carefully he'd saved. Brier Hollow Farm was different. By the time the Tully family finally gave up on it in the winter of 1990, after their 4th straight season, watching a spring flood drown out whatever they'd managed to plant that April, the farm's reputation had grown bad enough that even Garrison Lock, who normally moved quickly to absorb any decent ground that came through his land trust, had decided it wasn't worth the trouble of farming himself, only worth holding onto long enough to extract whatever water allocation and easement value the property still carried before letting somebody else deal with the liability of the land itself. The Tullis themselves left quietly that winter, their belongings loaded onto a single rented trailer, and more than one neighbor remembered watching them go with a kind of resigned sympathy, the same sympathy the county had extended to the 2 families before them, the sense that Brier Hollow simply chewed through whoever tried to love it and spit them back out poorer than they'd started. Garrison handled the Brier Hollow sale through the land trust office himself that spring, and when Owen Sharp walked in asking about it, having heard through a feed store conversation that the Tully place might finally be available, Garrison didn't bother hiding his surprise. "You want Brier Hollow," he said, leaning back in his chair behind a desk covered in foreclosure paperwork. "Son, I've had 3 families lose everything trying to farm that ground. The Tullis are the smart ones. They cut their losses before it cost them anything more than 4 years of bad harvests." Owen told him he understood the farm's history and wanted to see it anyway, and Garrison, after a long look that seemed to be deciding whether the conversation was worth continuing, named a price that was, by any honest measure of valley bottomland, almost nothing. $11,000 for 180 acres, against ground in better drained parts of the valley running closer to $2,000 an acre that same season. "I'm not trying to take advantage of you," Garrison said, spreading his hands the way a man does when he believes he's already being generous. "I'm doing you a favor, frankly. Most buyers wouldn't touch that ground for free, let alone pay for it. You want to throw away your savings on cursed dirt. That's your business, but I'd be lying if I said I thought you were making a smart decision. He leaned forward slightly, the kind of gesture meant to soften the next remark even as it landed just as pointed as the rest. I've watched 3 families lose their shirts on that ground, Owen. Good families. Hard workers, every one of them. If that land couldn't save people who actually knew what they were doing, I don't see what makes you different. He said it loud enough that the woman working the front desk glanced up from her typewriter, and Owen understood, standing there, that Garrison fully expected this conversation to be the first chapter in a story everyone in the county would eventually tell about another man who'd lost everything to that ground. Owen signed the papers 2 weeks later, $11,000 against 180 acres nobody else wanted, and Garrison mentioned to more than one person around the valley that month that he'd finally gotten the Tully place off the land trust's books, framing the sale, to anyone who asked, as a kindness extended to a young man too inexperienced to know better. He was not being cruel about it, not in any way he would have recognized as cruelty. He genuinely believed Brier Hollow was worthless ground that would cost Owen everything he'd saved, and he gave the matter no further thought once the paperwork cleared, certain the property would simply confirm what 3 previous families had already proven about it. Owen drove out to the farm the following weekend and walked the whole 180 acres on foot before he did anything else, boots sinking into low ground still soaked from snowmelt, kneeling at several points to look closely at soil that was darker and more acidic than anything he'd worked in 11 years of farming other men's fields. He had spent one season, 8 years earlier, working a cranberry operation 2 states over during a stretch when farm work had been scarce closer to home, and something about the particular wetness of this ground, the dark peaty soil, the way water sat on the surface without draining the way ordinary farmland drained, was tugging at a memory he hadn't expected to need again. When a neighbor stopped by that afternoon, curious about the unfamiliar truck parked at the old Tully gate, and asked, not unkindly, whether he'd really paid money for that cursed bottomland, Owen told him the truth as he understood it that day, that he'd paid less for 180 acres than most men paid for 20, precisely because nobody else had bothered to look closely at what that wetness might actually be good for. He stood at the gate a while after the neighbor drove off, looking down the slope toward the lowest, wettest ground, and found himself thinking less about the curse everyone kept warning him about than about a single bog 2 states over that had taught him, almost by accident, to see standing water as an asset instead of a failure waiting to happen. Pete Halloran had worked alongside Owen on 3 different operations over the better part of a decade, and when Owen told him that spring that he'd bought Brier Hollow outright, Pete's first reaction was to ask whether he'd lost his mind entirely. I helped pull a tractor out of that mud 2 summers running when I worked for the Tullis, Pete said, standing at the edge of the flooded bottomland with his hands on his hips. That ground doesn't drain, Owen. Doesn't matter what you plant in it. Corn, beans, doesn't matter. It comes up in April looking like a lake every single year. Owen didn't argue the point, because he knew Pete was right about everything he'd just said, and told him only that he didn't plan on planting corn or beans on it at all, an answer that left Pete more confused than reassured. Pete stayed close through that first spring anyway, mostly out of loyalty and partly, he admitted later, out of simple curiosity about how badly the whole thing was going to go. The rest of the county was less generous with their curiosity. At the feed store that April, the clerk asked Owen with a perfectly straight face whether he needed regular seed corn or whether he was planning to try his luck with something that actually liked standing in water, a comment that made its way around Eastfield County almost as fast as the original sale had. At the diner, men who'd known Owen for years as a steady, sensible hired hand speculated openly about how long it would take him to walk away from Brier Hollow the same way the Tullis had, some putting the number at 1 season, most agreeing it wouldn't take more than 2. Owen's own sister, the only family he had left in the area, drove out that May, looked at the standing water covering nearly 40 acres of the farm's lowest ground, and asked him directly whether he understood what he'd actually bought himself into. He told her the truth, which was that he understood it better than anyone in the county currently gave him credit for, though he didn't yet have the kind of proof that would make the claim sound like anything other than stubbornness dressed up as confidence. He did not, in those early weeks, have any formal plan he could explain to satisfaction, only the memory of a season spent on a cranberry bog 2 states over and a growing conviction, built from nothing more than walking the ground and watching how the water moved across it, That the very wetness everyone in the county treated as proof of a curse was actually the single most useful thing about the property. He spent that first spring doing almost nothing visible to anyone driving past on the county road, walking the low ground at different times of day, taking note of which sections held water longest, which drained fastest after a hard rain, where the soil ran darkest and most acidic compared to the higher, better drained ground at the property's edges. Pete, watching him do this instead of planting anything at all that first season, started to wonder out loud whether Owen had simply decided to let the place sit fallow and lick his wounds quietly instead of admitting outright that he'd made a mistake. A theory Owen never bothered correcting because he didn't yet have anything more convincing to offer in its place. There were evenings that spring when Owen himself wondered the same thing, standing at the edge of the flooded ground in the fading light with nothing yet to show for the decision he'd made. The weight of $11,000 and 11 years of saved-up wages sitting on a hunch he couldn't fully prove was anything more than a hunch. It was Pete, in the end, who suggested Owen get somebody from the state extension office out to look at the soil properly instead of just trusting his own memory of a season's work 2 states over. And in the early summer of 1990, Owen made the call and was eventually connected with Dr. Helen Castor, a horticulture specialist who, as it happened, had spent several years early in her career studying acid-loving bog crops before taking a county extension posting that mostly kept her busy with conventional row crop questions she found considerably less interesting. Castor drove out to Brier Hollow herself that July, walked the lowest 40 acres for the better part of an afternoon, took soil samples at a dozen points, and tested the water table depth before she said much of anything beyond the occasional surprised murmur. "This is remarkable ground," she said finally, crouching at the edge of standing water with a sample jar in hand. "Everyone who's looked at this property has been measuring it against what it can't do, which is grow a normal row crop. Nobody's apparently asked what it actually can do." She held the jar up to the light. "Your soil pH down here is running around 4.3 for 0.5 in places. That's acidic enough to kill almost any conventional crop you try to plant in it. But there's exactly one major commercial crop in this country that wants soil this acidic, wants a high water table this badly, and actually depends on the ability to flood a field on purpose instead of fighting to keep water off it." Owen asked her, already half certain of the answer, what crop she meant. "Cranberries," Castor said. "You've got peaty, acidic soil, a natural high water table, and cool enough nights this far north to support good fruit color and sugar development. I've seen maybe 3 properties in this entire region with conditions this close to ideal, and none of them were ever planted because nobody who owned them had any reason to think outside conventional row crop farming." Owen told her about the season he'd spent on a cranberry operation 2 states over, and Castor nodded slowly, the pieces evidently falling into place for her the same way they had been falling into place for him since the day he'd first walked the property. "Then you already understand more about what's sitting under your boots than 90% of the farmers in this county ever will," she said. "Everybody who looked at this ground asked whether it could grow corn. It can't. Nobody ever asked whether it could grow something else entirely, because nobody around here had ever seen a working bog and had no reason to imagine 1 inch." Owen asked her, carefully, what it would actually take to convert the lowest sections into something resembling a working cranberry operation. Castor walked him through it in plain terms: controlled flooding and draining infrastructure, sand top dressing for the beds, disease-resistant rootstocks suited to the region's shorter season, and patience, since a cranberry bed typically took 3 to 5 years to reach full production after planting. "It's not cheap, and it's not fast," she told him. "But pound for pound, established cranberry acreage outearns corn or soybeans by a wide margin, and you're sitting on ground that's been actively fighting every other crop anyone's tried to grow on it for over a decade. The land hasn't been cursed, Owen. It's just been asked the wrong question for 40 years straight." Before she left that afternoon, Castor offered to write up a short formal soil and hydrology summary, the kind of document that would carry far more weight with a lender than Owen's own word alone, and told him she'd be glad to come back the following spring to help guide the first planting, simply because she didn't often get the chance to see a theory she'd carried since graduate school finally tested on real, working ground. Owen did not tell Garrison Lock, or anyone connected to the land trust or the irrigation board he chaired, what Helen Castor had told him that summer, and he made a point over the following 2 years of keeping Brier Hollow's lowest acreage looking, from the county road, exactly as unremarkable and waterlogged as it always had. He secured a modest equipment loan that fell through a small agricultural credit union 2 counties away, an institution with no relationship whatsoever to Lock Farms or the Irrigation Board. Using Castor's soil analysis and his own 11 years of farming experience as his case, instead of the kind of established local credit history most lenders in Eastfield County expected to see. The loan covered enough to build basic flood and drainage infrastructure on a modest first section of the lowest ground, dikes and water control structures, sized to manage roughly 15 acres rather than the full 40 Castor had identified as suitable. Work Owen and Pete did mostly through the fall and winter when the county road past the farm carried almost no traffic to notice. Pete, who had spent that first season half convinced Owen had simply given up on farming the ground entirely, came around once Owen finally explained the plan in full, and though he remained skeptical about the timeline Castor had laid out, 3 to 5 years before full production felt like an eternity to a man used to seeing a harvest every single fall. He agreed to help with the infrastructure work in exchange for a modest wage and what he privately considered a fair amount of curiosity about how the whole experiment would eventually turn out. Castor came back twice more over the following 2 years, officially as routine extension follow-up and unofficially because she had grown genuinely invested in watching a theory she'd carried since her own early career finally get tested on real ground, helping Owen fine-tune planting density and water management as the first cranberry vines went into the sand-top beds in the spring of 1991. By the 3rd year, with the first beds approaching maturity and yields beginning to climb toward commercial volume, Owen had quietly secured a standing buyer in Renee Castellan, a regional purchaser for Briggs and Holt Cranberry Company, who had been searching for new growing regions further inland than the company's traditional coastal supply base. Drawn to Owen's operation after Castor mentioned it to a colleague at a regional horticulture conference, Castellan drove out to inspect the bog herself that spring, walked the beds twice, tasted fruit straight off the vine, and offered Owen a standing multi-year supply contract at a price per barrel that, once Owen worked through the math that evening at his kitchen table, made the $11,000 he'd paid for the entire property look almost absurdly small by comparison. None of this changed how Brier Hollow looked from the county road. Owen kept the upper, better-drained acreage in modest hay production, kept driving the same truck he'd always driven, and let the county's general impression of him, a hired hand who'd thrown his savings away on cursed bottomland and was probably regretting it quietly, continue largely unchallenged. Because a county that assumed he was struggling was a county that had no particular reason to look closely at what was actually happening on the lowest 40 acres of his property. By the close of that 3rd season, Owen had begun keeping a separate ledger for the bog operation entirely apart from the rest of the farm's modest books, a habit he'd started almost on instinct and would come to appreciate considerably more once those numbers ended up maturing far beyond his own kitchen table. It took Garrison Lock nearly 3 years to notice anything had changed at Brier Hollow, mostly because for most of those 3 years there had been nothing visible from the road to suggest any change had occurred at all. What finally caught his attention, in the early spring of 1993, was a refrigerated delivery truck with out-of-county plates parked at Owen's gate 2 mornings a week, spotted by one of Lock's own hands driving the county road on routine business. Garrison asked around the way he always asked around in a valley where he sat on the land trust and the irrigation board, expecting to learn within a few days exactly what kind of trouble or opportunity he was looking at. He found very little. Owen's equipment loan wasn't through any lender Garrison had influence with, and nobody at the local co-op could recall him buying conventional seed or fertilizer in any meaningful quantity in over 2 years, which struck Garrison as strange for a 180-acre operation he had assumed was either fallow or quietly failing. For a man whose authority in Eastfield County rested heavily on always knowing exactly what was happening on every acre of ground in the valley, not knowing was its own kind of insult, and Garrison did not sit easily with insults he hadn't seen coming. He drove out to Brier Hollow himself that April, found the lowest 40 acres transformed into something he barely recognized. Neat flooded beds with dense, glossy vines, water control structures he didn't remember approving any permit for, and Owen standing at the edge of one bed and waiters checking a water gauge that came back showing levels he hadn't expected that ground to hold on purpose. Garrison didn't say much that visit beyond a few pointed questions about whether Owen had filed the proper paperwork with the irrigation board for the water retention infrastructure he was looking at, and left without renewing any offer to buy the property back, having apparently decided a different approach made more sense. By that summer, with word of the operation reaching regional buyers beyond Castellan's usual territory and a brief item in a state agricultural newsletter mentioning an unusual inland cranberry operation thriving in Eastfield County, Garrison turned his attention to the one lever still entirely under his control: the Irrigation and Drainage Board's authority over water retention structures and flood management compliance across the valley. He filed a formal complaint that summer alleging that Owen's flooded beds violated a long-standing county drainage easement requiring upstream landowners along that stretch of the valley to actively drain rather than retain floodwater, citing potential downstream flood risk to neighboring properties that, as it happened, included a significant portion of Lock Farms itself. The complaint demanded Owen drain the beds and dismantle the water control infrastructure within 90 days or face formal enforcement action through the board. What Garrison did not anticipate, because it had genuinely never occurred to him to check, was that the very drainage easement his complaint relied on had been drafted and personally filed by Garrison himself more than 20 years earlier, back when Lock Farms first expanded into the lower valley. Language written specifically to require upstream water retention rather than drainage in exactly the section of the valley where Brier Hollow sat, a provision Garrison had insisted on at the time, precisely to protect his own downstream fields from flood surges, and had apparently forgotten the actual wording of in the 2 decades since. The special hearing convened that August in the County Administration Building, presided over by hearing officer Marion Albright, since Garrison, as both the complainant and a sitting irrigation board member, had been required to recuse himself from voting on his own complaint, though nothing stopped him from presenting it in person to a room that filled well past its usual capacity for what most attendees understood was less a routine drainage dispute than a public reckoning 3 years in the making. Garrison presented his case methodically, citing the county drainage easement by section number, describing Owen's water retention beds as a flood liability that violated the upstream drainage requirement the easement was meant to enforce, language that, to a room mostly unfamiliar with the actual text of a 20-year-old county filing, sounded like a serious and possibly fatal complaint against Owen's entire operation. When Albright asked whether Mr. Sharp wished to respond, Owen stood, and rather than disputing the existence of the easement Garrison had cited, he asked the hearing officer's permission to read the actual text of it into the record, a copy he had obtained from the county recorder's office that spring after Garrison's initial visit had made him curious enough to check exactly what paperwork governed his property. Albright granted the request, and Owen read aloud a section of the document that directly contradicted everything Garrison had just argued. The easement required upstream landowners in that section of the valley to actively retain and manage floodwater on their own property rather than draining it downstream, explicitly to protect the larger operations below, including the document specified by name, Lock Farms itself. Dr. Helen Castor spoke next, confirming 3 years of water table and soil monitoring data showing Owen's beds operating well within safe retention capacity and, if anything, reducing downstream flood risk compared to the unmanaged flooding the property had produced under its previous 3 owners. Renee Castellan spoke briefly after that, confirming a standing multi-year supply contract and yields that had grown steadily each season as the beds matured, evidence that the operation was not only compliant but increasingly significant to the regional cranberry supply chain. Garrison, watching his own 20-year-old document get read back to the room as the clearest possible evidence against his own complaint, said very little by the time Albright called for a ruling. There was nothing in the easement that supported draining Brier Hollow's beds, and considerable language requiring exactly the opposite, language Garrison himself had insisted on including decades earlier without apparently remembering, in the years since, what it actually said or why he'd wanted it there in the first place. Albright dismissed the complaint on the record, noted for the minutes that Mr. Sharp's operation appeared to be in full compliance with the very easement cited against him, and closed the hearing considerably faster than it had opened. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone repeated, just loud enough to carry, the word Garrison himself had used about Brier Hollow for years, cursed, and the laughter that followed it landed nowhere close to where it would have landed 3 years earlier, before half the room had watched a man's own paperwork dismantle his case in front of his neighbors. Garrison sat at the complainant's table through the rest of the brief session without saying much of anything else, the folder of supporting documents he'd brought still open in front of him. Several pages he'd apparently never thought to reread before walking in that morning, so certain of his position. Word of the hearing moved through Eastfield County faster than the formal ruling paperwork ever could, and within a season, 2 separate landowners with low, poorly draining ground of their own, acreage that had sat fallow or marginally productive for years, called Owen directly asking whether he'd be willing to walk their property and tell them honestly whether it might be worth converting instead of continuing to fight it as ordinary row crop ground. He visited both properties that fall, brought Helen Castor out for soil testing on one of them, and ended up helping a young couple convert a stubborn 15-acre wet corner of their own farm into a small secondary bog using rootstock cuttings from his own beds, asking nothing in return beyond the same kind of forward favor nobody had ever extended to him, and that he'd had to build entirely from nothing himself. Regional agricultural press coverage of Eastfield County over the following 2 years shifted in a way that had little to do with the county's traditional corn and soybean output, and everything to do with a small but growing reputation for unconventional, high-value specialty crop production on ground previously written off as worthless, coverage that, while never naming Garrison Lock directly, made clear which long-standing local assumptions about land value had just been publicly overturned. Garrison did not lose Lock Farms, his seat on the land trust, or his position on the irrigation board over any of it, and Lock Farms remained, by acreage, the largest agricultural operation in Eastfield County for years afterward. What he lost, more gradually and more permanently, was the assumption, held by nearly everyone in the valley for 2 decades including Garrison himself, that his judgment about what counted as worthless ground was simply correct by default. Pete Halloran, who had spent that first season half convinced he was watching a friend waste his entire life savings on cursed bottomland, stayed on at Brier Hollow well past the point most hired hands would have moved to steadier, more conventional work, and told anyone who asked that he'd rather manage 40 acres of difficult, unconventional ground than 400 acres of corn that drowned the same way every spring, whether anyone respected it or not, a line he repeated often enough around the county that it became something close to a standing joke at his own expense, one he seemed genuinely to enjoy telling on himself. Renee Castellan's company expanded its contract with Owen significantly over the following 2 seasons as the beds reached full maturity, and eventually proposed a longer-term partnership arrangement that gave Owen a more direct stake in the cranberry market rather than simply selling raw fruit at a flat seasonal price. Garrison Lock came out to Brier Hollow himself for the first time in over a year that fall, parking at the same gate where he'd once told a young hired hand, with a perfectly straight face, that he was doing him a favor by selling him cursed dirt for almost nothing. He asked Owen, with considerably less of his old certainty in his voice, whether he'd be willing to let Helen Castor take a look at a stubborn, poorly draining low corner of his own 1,200 acres that he'd spent 30 years treating as nothing but a nuisance to be drained and fought every spring. Owen told him he would, on the same terms he'd already extended to his other neighbors, and didn't make him stand at the gate apologizing for a decade of certainty he probably still didn't fully understand the irony of. He didn't need to. The contract figures coming in season after season had already said everything that needed saying. The lesson Eastfield County eventually took from the whole affair, repeated at the feed store counter and the diner booth for years afterward in place of the old stories about cursed ground, was simpler than the soil chemistry that actually explained it. The label a community settles on for a piece of land, or a person, often says considerably more about who never bothered to ask a different question than it does about the land or the person itself. Garrison Lock had spent 2 decades treating Brier Hollow's wet, acidic bottomland as proof of nothing but bad luck and bad farming, certain enough in that judgment that he never once considered, until his own 20-year-old paperwork was read back to him in a packed hearing room. That the very water table he'd once written into a drainage easement to protect his own fields might also be the exact thing that made the ground above it valuable, in a way row crop farming had never once been able to reveal. Owen Sharp walked that flooded bottomland on a cold spring morning in 1990 and asked the one question nobody who'd owned the property before him had ever thought to ask: not how to fight the water, but what the water itself might actually be good for. And 3 patient years later, the answer to that question had turned $11,000 of supposedly cursed dirt into the most talked-about 40 acres in the entire valley. Drive past Brier Hollow Farm along the county road today, and the lowest ground no longer looks like anything anyone would call cursed. The beds still flood every winter and drain every spring, exactly the way a working cranberry operation is supposed to. But the cycle that once drowned 3 families' worth of corn and soybeans now produces, by the season, a crop worth several times what the same acreage would ever have managed as ordinary row crop ground. A gap that exists for precisely the reason the original price was so low in the first place. Nobody bothered to ask the right question about that water before deciding the ground beneath it was worthless. Garrison Lock still runs the largest farming operation in Eastfield County, and still sits on both the land trust and the irrigation board. None of that changed. What changed, quietly and permanently, was that nobody in the valley assumes anymore that the man who owns the most ground automatically understands the value of all of it. It's worth sitting with how easily the whole thing could have gone the other way. If Owen had never spent that one season on a cranberry bog 2 states over, he might have looked at Brier Hollow's flooded ground and seen exactly what everyone else saw. If Pete hadn't suggested calling the extension office, Helen Castor's expertise might never have crossed paths with a property that needed it so specifically. And if Garrison hadn't filed his own complaint, certain he held every advantage, nobody would have ever had reason to read his own 20-year-old easement back to him as the clearest proof of exactly what he'd forgotten about his own paperwork. Ground like that exists, in some form, in nearly every county where a community has decided, often without ever quite saying so out loud, that the thing nobody else wants is automatically worth nothing, which is exactly why the answer so often turns out to be sitting in plain, waterlogged, overlooked sight, waiting for someone willing to ask what it might actually be good for instead of simply what it can't do. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps these videos reach more people who'd appreciate them. Share it with somebody who's ever been told the thing they bought, or believed in, was worthless. They'll know exactly why you're sending it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one landing in your feed. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you saw value in something everyone else had already written off. We read every single one.